To mark the death of a protester, farmers in India to resume their action on Friday. They're most notably demanding legally binding price guarantees for their crops. 2 months before the country goes to the polls, they've clashed with police in their attempts to march on the capital. In his first comments after a week of protests, incumbent Prime Minister Narendra Modi insisting his government's committed to the welfare of farmers. Meanwhile, human rights groups expressing concern over the suspension of Twitter accounts of those voicing support for the farmers. For more, let's cross to correspondent Pavni Mittal in Delhi. Pavni, what more do we know?
Hi, Francois. It is evident that the government is sort of cracking down and trying to make sure the protests don't go out of its hands. Social media site X is now saying that it has suspended several accounts. Media reports suggest that these accounts were of people, activists and reporters who were posting about these farmers' protests. X says it doesn't agree with these orders, but it doesn't have a choice. It has to comply with local laws to avoid penalties and also possible imprisonment of its employees over here in India. It's also important to remember that this is not the first time the government has issued such orders. Back in 2020 and 2021, when farmers held a massive year-long agitation against agricultural reforms, similar orders were passed. At the time, the site was called Twitter. Now, opposition parties as well as activists are slamming these orders, saying the government is trying to muzzle democracy. India is headed for general elections in about a few weeks, and this just tells you how important it is for the government to sort of contain these protests. Farmers are an important voting bloc, and it doesn't want to alienate them.
Yeah, this reminds us of when there were the big protests in 2020, 2021, and Friday's supposed to be a big day.
Yes, these protests are gaining traction. One more union, in fact, the union that was front and center of those protests in 2020 and 2021 is now joining. It is leading the protest on Friday, saying it will observe a, quote, Black Day. It will hold tractor marches across the country, blocking highways. It says it will also burn effigies of top ministers in the government. We are told that the farmers who are sitting in, they were supposed to march to Delhi, but after the death of one protester on Wednesday, after police clashes, it observed a sit-in today. They are expected to resume their march on possibly either Friday or Saturday. We don't have much clarity at this stage. Authorities say that in those clashes, at least one police officer died and several others were injured. Now, the government is trying to do what it can to sort of stem these protests. On one hand, it has beefed up securities, fire, tear gas. You're playing those visuals on the screen right now. Barricades have been set up, barbed wires. On the other hand, it is also asking the farmers to come back to the table and hold another round of talks. This would be the 5th round of talks between the farmers and the government. But Francois, as someone who has reported on these protests and the protests before, it is very clear that this is not going to end anytime soon. There is a complete breakdown of trust between the farmers and the government, and these look like these are going to spiral further.
Pavni Mittal, many thanks for that live update. Protests by farmers in India resonating with those who've been watching a swell of protests here in Europe, also over cost of living. As Washington urges Israel not to launch a ground operation in the Gaza Strip's southernmost city after